This is number 8 in our ideology and politics class, and it follows off lecture number 7, which I dealt with secularism. There's been a wing within the Enlightenment. We call it the right wing of the Enlightenment. It's embodied in, for example, the new atheists of today, in which religion is the problem and secularism is the ideological answer. So within a hard form of secularism, they want to be free from religion and free to forge their own way without the shackles, the burdens of religion in that sense. So you can see secularism, particularly hard or aggressive secularism, is very much comes out of that ideological tradition. But in the previous lecture, I looked at 3 types of secularism: hard or aggressive, soft, passive, and pluralist. And certainly even within the Frankfurt School, as I mentioned earlier, the movement away from harder secularism to recognizing that culture, social issues, religion is very much a part of what it means to be human and to form a good society. So people like Jürgen Habermas, who was of the second generation of the Frankfurt School, he recognized the importance of religion within politics itself and a part of a social, cultural, literary heritage. So those who negate religion in terms of trying to think through the good, often shrink the good to just merely a secular, and then the secular becomes the sacred, essentially. Anytime people negate something, what inevitably happens, the good that they negate is missed. So essentially when the secular negates the sacred, the secular then becomes the sacred in that sense. Now, in the last few years, obviously since 9/11, there has been a great interest in Islam, and Islam is one of the fastest growing and the biggest religions in the world. It has a strong political bent. And since 9/11, the West is very, very much divided on how to understand Islam. On the right, Islam is seen as the problem, and all sorts of obviously empirical evidence can be lifted in terms of terrorism and violence, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, Al-Shabaab, Muslim Brotherhood, Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia. And so within that right of center in the West, they feed into, in one sense, a secular model, even though coming from a Western understanding respecting religion, but Islam is the problem. There's a tendency, and of course this comes out of Samuel Huntington's work after the end of the Cold War in '89. He argued, be careful of what you perceive as the end of ideology in which the liberal capitalist West is won and communism is lost. He argues we're going to have now a clash of civilizations. And of these great civilizations, Islam is going to be one of the most dangerous to the West, and then out of this you get the clash of civilizations model. Now, the liberal tradition, on the other hand, has tended to argue, a softer liberal tradition, that in fact there's much good in Islam. And anyone who watches the film, for example, Empire of Faith, you look at liberal academics again and again looking at the good of Islam, the history of Islam as it has moved from the 7th century forward, the architecture, the philosophy, the great mosques, the theology, how it has built civilizations itself. So Western thought and culture and the academy itself has become divided between a right of center understanding of Islam, which only looks at the negative, and a left of center progressive view that only looks at the positive. So both ideological tendencies go cherry picking with their view of Islam itself. And so when we think of the West and Islam, we always have to be asking ourselves, whose interpretation of Islam? And Islam, like any great religious tradition, has wide elements to it in terms of even its origins, the Sunni, the Shiite, various fragments within the Shiite and the Sunni itself. And so the danger is saying, well, Islam is this homogenous group. We must be wary of it because there's violence, there's terrorists, there's jihadists. But in a certain point, you have to ask, whose version of Islam are we talking? So just as in Judaism, you can get dovish people on the left, hawkish people on the right, Zionists in Christianity, you can get reactionaries on the right, left, center. So in Islam, it is no different in that sense. And so when we approach Islam, very important to understand that it's a complex religious phenomena that cannot be reduced to any simple formula or category in that sense. Now, when we hear the word Islam, most people think formally it began in the 7th century with Muhammad himself. Gabriel comes via Allah to give him the word of the final truth, and most people think then Islam begins in the 7th century. Now, Islam itself sees itself very much as standing on the shoulders of Judaism and Christianity. It argues that the origins of Islam come with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and as Judaism deteriorated, then Christianity came, and Christ came as in that sense, a reformer, a prophet to recall people to the authentic faith that Allah had given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Christianity itself was the next stage, and almost an early form of Hegelian dialectic in bringing to be the truth for a short season. But just as Judaism itself had faltered, had betrayed the calling of Jehovah, God, so Christianity over time faltered and failed, and the light dimmed, and there was the need for the truth to come again. And in that sense, Muhammad was the seal of the prophets. And so you have this history in Islam, even though it begins formally in the 7th century, they go right back to the foundations of the Jewish tradition, the Christian tradition, and they see themselves as the final revelation in that sense. This is a certain interpretation of Islam. Obviously, there's going to be others within Islam itself, within the Muslim community, which are going to critique some of that also, particularly at P.A.I coming out of Iran and the Ahmadiyya tradition coming out of the 19th century as well. Now, one of the issues that is important to ask in all of this is this particular read of history, again, when we think ideology in politics, is the Muslim read of history. Do the Jews accept that? Well, obviously not. Do the Christians accept it? And certainly within the first, certainly what you get within certain branches of Islam is that Muhammad had to come to correct the darkness that existed at the time within the Mediterranean community. And Christianity had faltered and fallen. It had assimilated to the state, had become an agent of power. It had lost its integrity. The life of Christ had been thinned out. And Muhammad came just as Jesus came to deal and reform Judaism. Muhammad had come to reform and make the Jewish and the Christian vision, enhance it, flesh it out, and bring it to its fulfillment as the seal of the prophets. Now, one question that has to be asked, and this is where we get into ideology of history, or whose version of history. And so if one starts from the position of a certain Muslim read of history, that Christianity by the 7th century had become so dimmed and had lost its light, it lost its integrity, that it needed to be reformed. Is that true to the facts of the history? Well, in fact, from the 2nd to the 7th centuries of Christianity, this is called the patristic era, both in the East and West. This, in fact, by many is seen as the golden age of Christianity. This had nothing to do with the dimming. This was a great area of contemplative theology, prophetic politics, creating civilization itself in the West and the East. And so whether in the West, whether you have an Augustine, the city of God, Ambrose, Jerome, Benedict, the East, a great political theology of John Chrysostom, the orphanages, the hospitals that were built. This was a period of immense flowering of Western civilization. And so very interesting when one thinks of the Muslim read of Christian history in the first few centuries that is not true to that history itself. And so they build their theory on the coming to be of Islam in terms of a view of history and Christian history and Western history, which is false to the facts of that history. And so when one begins to look at issues of Islam in the West, it's very, very important in entering this discussion that people understand how history itself is being read by Muslims, particularly in the first generation. The second thing that often needs to be looked at, and of course in the Quran itself, which is seen as the holy book of Islam. Now, if you're on the right, again, people will just pick on the negative verses in the various surahs of violence, treatment of women, and a variety of things like this, certain negative views of Judaism and Christianity. If a person's on the left, they're only going to look at the positive verses, surahs in the Quran. And of course, the Quran, like the Bible itself, is layered with all sorts of different understandings of the relationship of God and the Jewish tradition, and Jews and God, Christianity. And so the verses that a person, or the chapters that the books people choose to use, will say more about their ideological bent than it does about the complex nature of the texts themselves. And so, as within Judaism and Christianity and Islam, you have the Bible and you have the Quran, then you get into reads of whose version of these texts, and then we're back into ideology and politics itself. So when we think of the West and Islam, there's a certain hard secularism which wants to turn against all forms of religion, and you'll get this in the New Atheists and certain very right-wing notions of the Enlightenment. And even within the Frankfurt School, they're talking about the dialectic of the Enlightenment, and how there's a very tradition within Enlightenment in which reason and rationalism gives certainty, and they look at how that played into certain elements of fascism and Nazism, and they argued within the Enlightenment there's a dialectic here which should include religion itself, of which Habermas himself was a part. And so when one looks at secularism, the question always is whose version, hard, soft, or pluralist? And then when we look at often how Islam interprets or Muslims interpret their early critique of Christianity, what has to be asked is how is ideology at work there, and how would Christians respond to this distorted reading of the golden age for many of Christianity. And then when it gets to the Quran or the Bible, as I said, you're going to have certain members of both Muslims, Jews, and Christians. Sometimes many will pick on the more violent, the warrior, the aggressive, the purist, the reformer side, and they'll select certain verses from their texts. And then you have people on the center left in these three traditions will often pick on what would be seen as more moderate, more peaceful, more ironical texts. And so this is where we get into ideology, hermeneutics, and interpretation. So when we enter the issues of Islam in the West, it's very, very important to understand that ideology is very, very much at work, and we must be always wary of simplistic approaches both to the history of these traditions and then how these texts are read themselves.